Hi, my name is Lindsay Omark, and for my teaching professional presentation, I'll be talking about student uniforms and dress codes in schools. In my presentation, I'll be discussing school policies, the rights schools have to make those policies, and the rights students have. And to frame this discussion, I'll refer to legal cases and their influences on students, teachers, and the education system in general. So first, I'll start my discussion with dress codes in general, and here I'll be focusing on what restrictions school policies can impose on students and what rights students have on their own dress. So really all schools have dress codes. I'm sure all the schools you've attended have had dress codes. So when schools are writing new dress code policies, if there are any issues, most of all of the decisions are left up to state courts. In almost all cases, the U.S. Supreme Court really does try to stay out of it. Consistently, they have declined to address dress code issues with schools. So while the Supreme Court has stayed out of students' dress code and student clothing, in general, dress and appearance is associated with your First Amendment right to free expression. So what this really means is that your dress and your appearance can be a reflection of your self-expression, your values, your background, your culture, and or your personality. However, while you have this freedom of expression through dress, we'll see later in this presentation that most of the time student dress is loosely related to freedom of expression. And not always will your First Amendment right defend your dress code and sort of support you in what you wish to wear. Which brings me to my last point, which is schools cannot restrict students based on fashion or taste. So school boards and districts have certain limitations on their dress code policies and on what they can and cannot restrict. Schools can restrict dress and appearance based on reasonableness in the following: health and safety, community standards, disruption to school, and relationship to gangs. The real debatable part of school dress code policies is being able to defend the reasonableness of these categories. In the following slides, I'll describe each of the following in more detail, and we'll begin to see a better idea of what reasonableness is. But with, as with every other subjective word or idea, the definition of reasonableness can be stretched and varied based on what's considered reasonable. So it's not always the same for everyone. And we'll look into what schools, for the most part, have been considering reasonable. So dress code restrictions and health and safety. Schools can regulate dress based on keeping all students safe and healthy, and for the most part, that's extremely reasonable. Schools have a justifiable reason to prohibit dress that they believe to be a threat. The first example is sunglasses. These obviously restrict a student's vision indoors, and they also make a student less identifiable to school staff and teachers. So it's reasonable for them to be restricted. Other things that are restricted often are chains, and sharp jewelry, and slippers, or having no shoes. Also, most schools prohibit anything other than sneakers in gym. And again, that's for obvious safety reasons. Now, I would say the last two bullets are more uncommon, and you may not have known this, but schools can prohibit students from having long hair if it poses a reasonable danger to them. For example, if a student with long hair is working in a lab or vocational setting. In a lab, there may be fire or chemicals, and in a vocational setting, there's tools and heavy machinery, and having long hair can pose a safety risk to students. So schools can tell students they can't have long hair. I think in most cases, the rule would be if you had long hair that you had to pull it up, or maybe wear like a hairnet or something. But schools can have policies for not having long hair. And finally, schools can basically tell students they have to wash their hair, and particularly if it's excessively dirty and may be a host to fungus or lice, which is easily passed around the school. So again, that's for a health reason. Schools don't want that to be an issue, so they can tell a student to wash their hair. Next, we'll talk about dress code restrictions as far as community standards. So unlike restrictions based on health and safety, community standards are definitely much more debatable. And while I believe it's harder to determine the reasonableness with community standards, schools can still restrict dress based on them. So this means schools in different districts legally can enforce different dress codes based on justifiable reasons specific to their own community. So again, this just means that the school district I grew up in may have different community standards than a school in another county in the same state or in another state altogether. But each policy is justifiable in its own right. So some examples of dress that may be restricted based on community standards are a dress that draws too much attention to your body. This means clothes that may be too revealing. In my research, I found some schools that consider showing your collarbone too much attention to your body. And in other schools, students may be allowed to wear tops that your collarbones and your shoulders are showing. So based on community standards, you can get away with different policies and different dress codes. Other restrictions might include clothing that are too loose or deemed too tight. And again, this is subjective to the school and the area you live in, and even the time you live in. So maybe 30 years ago, opposed to today, different standards have applied. So other restrictions are clothes that are sheer or have large holes, tops that are spaghetti, or halter straps, or strapless, or too low cut. And as far as pants or bottoms, some schools restrict leggings, pajama pants, or shorts and skirts that are just too short. Next, we have dress codes that restrict based on disruption to school. So again, these restrictions are definitely more debatable. However, schools can implement them if they can reasonably justify that the dress results in material or a substantial disruption. So even just the word substantial, it means a great amount of disruption, but that can be extremely subjective. So determining how much damage clothing is doing will really determine if a school policy is constitutional or unconstitutional. It's also important to note that schools can restrict dress in which they justify has a reasonable expectation of disruption. So again, expectation, it's important part of the definition, but it's also another very subjective word in determining if this school policy is reasonable. So we'll get into more examples of dress that causes disruption to school on the next slide. So again, school restricts clothes that violate school standards, and it's especially important, and they especially restrict clothes that violate students based on race, gender, color, religion, language, sexual orientation, and national origin. So these violations are extremely important and usually considered more severe. In general, though, some examples of disruptive dress can include hats with inappropriate slogans, t-shirts with vulgar or lewd language, or jewelry in the shape of obscene gestures. So here I have an example of a necklace giving the middle finger. But in general, the disruption to school is usually not based on the actual piece of clothing, so not the hat or the t-shirt or the jewelry in general, but what its message conveys to other students. So we're focusing here on slogans and the language used and the gestures, especially if they violate students' natural rights. So finally, I'll talk about dress code restrictions in relations to gangs. So students in gangs are obviously dangerous threats to school safety. And it's important for schools to be aware of gangs and aware of how they work. So specifically, in this case, schools and their faculty need to be aware that gang members wear specific clothing to show their affiliation and their commitment to the gang. By being aware of this clothing, teachers and staff can help limit gang promotion in school. So obviously, dress related to gangs is reasonably restricted. Some examples of dress that may be related to gangs in some cases are bandanas, dress with specific symbols related to gangs on them. But it's also important to note that gangs are changing their dress to become less recognizable. So some gangs are known to wear sports caps and jackets and t-shirts, which can easily be confused for non-gang affiliated dress. So again, it's just important for schools to have a really large awareness for gang apparel and to restrict it as best as they possibly can for the safety of the students. Now I'll begin to talk about legal cases surrounding school dress code policies. I'll talk about the history of the legal case and the implication it has for schools, students, teachers, and education in general. The first legal case is Carr v. Schmidt. In 1972, in a Texas high school, a male student was suspended for having long hair. The policy specifically prohibited all males from having their hair hanging over their ears or over their collarbone or from obstructing their view. So the student filed a case against the school. He believed that it was his First Amendment right to wear his hair how he wished. The court rule on this case had some interesting points. The judge explained that some people may wear their hair as an expression of their values or culture or self. But in this case, and many other cases, for the most part, it's personal taste or peer influence. So really, boys and girls wear their hair based on gender influences and how other people that they relate to wear it, not based on their own personal self-expression. So the court ruling was that it's not unconstitutional to prohibit certain hairstyles in public schools. So obviously the implications for this are that schools